whatever it is that has caused that crisis, people are expending tremendous energy when they're in that state. And at a certain point, you can't keep that up. The person is going to calm down and is going to get to a better state. So sometimes it's just about taking the time to be with that person and just ensure that they're safe long enough that they start coming down to a place where now you can start having a better conversation with.
Hey, it's Katie, your host for today's episode. When someone's experiencing a mental health crisis, what is the right response? A typical response might look like police officers arriving on the scene to de-escalate, and after the moment has passed, little, if any, follow-up support. So what happens when a peer supporter is one of the first to show up on the scene and stays involved even weeks after the crisis? This is Just Like Me, a podcast about showing up for one another through peer support and putting lived experience at the center of mental health care. Today, I'm talking with Jeremy Ruling. Jeremy is a social worker and peer supporter who has spent years advocating for systems change and thinking about what it means to really support someone. In this conversation, we talk about the role of peer support during and after a crisis and how peer support is becoming intertwined with the system for better or for worse. One idea we keep coming back to is this. When we're in a crisis, one of our deepest unmet needs is safety through connection. It was really great to have Jeremy on. As someone like myself who's still really new to peer support, I asked him a lot of questions and I learned a ton. There's so much to take from this one. Here's our conversation. So Jeremy, you are a board member for the Alliance for Rights and Recovery. And I was wondering if you could share something about how they have been pressing for non-police crisis interventions for the last decade and more.
Sure. So first of all, just for a little background about the Alliance, they are a statewide organization in New York, although the Alliance has been increasingly involved in a lot of national conversations and advocacy efforts. There's really a large breadth of things that the Alliance does, but one of the things that's really been high on their list for the last few years is to try to help change how crisis response looks for people who are in distress from mental health or substance use or other kinds of things that fall under that behavioral health umbrella. There was a person in Rochester, New York in 2020 named Daniel Prude. Daniel was someone who was under the influence of substances, had run out in the street, was kind of causing a commotion. He didn't have clothes on, I believe, when it happened. And when police responded, things kind of went bad and he ended up getting shot and killed. And after that, there was a really big push in New York for a law called Daniel's Law. And what Daniel's Law would do is it would basically mandate that across the state, there are non-police crisis response teams that are available to help people who are experiencing some sort of mental health or substance use crisis. So there's been some discussion about what these teams would look like. There's a few different models that are out there, but one of the more common ones is that you would have a clinician, so a social worker or someone like that, paired with someone who is a peer specialist. So someone who has their own lived experience of recovering from mental health or substance use or trauma. And that team would go out to respond instead of the police. Obviously, there's a lot of training they would go through. There is a lot of criteria they would need to be aware of to be able to look at the situation and determine if there's risk factors that might call for a different level of response. Mm-hmm. But ideally that they would be able to use their training and their experience as mental health practitioners to be with that person and to find out what's going on, what has brought that person to that state of crisis, and to help them de-escalate.
Mm-hmm. Can you take me into maybe a moment in time where, there is a person
who is experiencing a mental health crisis and they need this type of intervention, and the team shows up, or maybe even take me to like the beginning part of like, who do you call? And, how quickly does somebody arrive? And then what, sort of from there?
So there's this kind of what currently exists in the places where you have crisis teams responding, and there's also what would be the most ideal. I would say that many places are not operating at a fully ideal capacity yet, just because the funding, the infrastructure, all those things are not really in place yet. Um, Ideally, what you would want, right, is you would want it to go through a a call center, through something like 988, or it could also go through 911. It probably often would, where you have dispatchers who actually have been trained on identifying crisis, so that they, just as they would know, for example, somebody in a medical emergency needs an ambulance, right? Somebody is behaving erratically, but there's no evidence that they are making direct threats towards anybody. You would call for a mobile crisis team to come and respond in that situation. And ideally, it should be like any other emergency response. A call comes in and you have someone there within 15 minutes or so. One of the more successful ones that got a lot of attention was in Eugene, Oregon. There was a team called Cahoots, and that was where you had a clinician and a peer who went out, and they were completely independent of any kind of police response. So when they showed up at situations, the vast majority of the time, it was them without other responders being part of it. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but their success rate was astounding. Obviously, then they would work with the person to follow up to make sure that they were getting all the supports and resources they needed moving forward. That's a very important part of the puzzle, right? You have the actual crisis that's occurring in the moment, and then you want to make sure that that person, that their risk of going into a similar crisis is decreased by making sure that they're getting supports, whether that means they're getting connected to mental health services, maybe it's community resources, like they need help with food or clothing or finding childcare. It could be a lot of different things that drive people into crises.
Okay, so from the first phone call that happens, there's some follow through that they get.
Yes, I mean, that's how it should be set up. Follow-up is going to be really important because crisis rarely happens in isolation. Crisis is usually something that happens because there's something that's happening, with and to that person.
Mhm.
And it's happening because there's an unmet need of some sort.
So it sounds like from what you're saying, just as far as even the follow through goes, each person is so unique and individual in what they need that it's not like just a blanket response where you show up and you de-escalate and you leave, but you're saying there's so much context into why a person's having a mental health crisis that every individual needs a specific plan afterwards. And police aren't necessarily set up to do that type of follow through.
Right. And so, the thing with police training is that they used to not receive very much training around mental health challenges at all. That is something that's improved a lot. A lot of police officers now receive what's called CIT training, where they have really learned how to intervene in crisis. So that's a really positive thing from the police side. That being said, police officers are still trained to always be looking for threats that they need to be alert to at all times. And the other thing is that police respond to calls, but then they respond to the next call. And the calls could be of very different natures. And so that follow-up is very, very difficult for police to provide in any meaningful way. There are definitely officers who have a lot of concern for something that may have happened and make sure to follow up with the person who might have been in crisis. But a lot of times it's just they don't have the capacity to do that. And one of the things that a crisis team can do is it builds into its structure that follow-up, which is a lot different than just saying, we're going to refer someone to the next service, right? The mental health system and the other sort of systems of care that we have out there are very good sometimes at referring people on to the next place. But, that leaves a lot of gaps in between. And one of the things that a mobile team can do is if they have a certain period of time with the team that I used to lead, we had a defined sort of 2-week period usually where we were continually engaged with that person. So they actually knew who we were. And it was people who were walking them through those steps that they were developing. While it was a short-term relationship, they were still developing a relationship with us that allowed us to make sure that they were secure in the different kinds of follow-up services before just leaving them at that spot.
Yeah. And I want to get back to your point about the referral system and how it seems like it's just like this bottomless pit of being referred and referred and referred back into the system until you're so deep into it that you don't even know where you are anymore, maybe, or who you are. But I first wanted to bring up the story of Doug Martin, who I know you were a fan of growing up, and a football player who recently was having a mental health crisis, and the police were called because he had entered a neighbor's home. And we don't know the full details of it now, but he did end up dying in police custody. And I just wonder if you could share your perspective on that moment and what kind of questions it helps us ask again about how important it is to think about the crisis response model.
Sure. So Doug Martin was someone that I had followed because I grew up in Idaho, and in Idaho, you don't really have professional sports teams. So you cheer for your college team. So for me, that was the Boise State Broncos, and that's where Doug Martin had gone to school. So I had been a big fan of his. I had followed his career, and he had a really good one. And I was watching a football game, and they announced on the air for that game that it was dedicated to his memory. And I was kind of blown away. I was like, well, what happened? So I started looking into it and saw that he had had some sort of mental health challenge, that he had been having challenges for a while. There's a whole other thing we could get into about the impact of the game of football on people's mental health due to the head injuries that they sustain. So that's certainly something that's very likely to be part of the story here. But when I read the story, I couldn't help but think, like, here's a person who is in mental health crisis and who died during that interaction. And it's just something that we've seen way too many times. And it also wasn't lost on me that he was a still youngish Black male who probably is still somewhat physically imposing due to all those years of being a football player and just the way that he was built. And that's something, of course, we know happens too often in our society also, that Black men in interactions with police, it doesn't always go well. And my hope is that we find out that everybody behaved and responded the way that we would want them to. All we really know right now from what I've seen in the news is that he was in custody and he died while he was in custody. So there's unanswered questions, and it's incredibly possible, and it's probably actually even more likely that the police did their job the correct way during that time. Because I do think the majority of the time, despite challenges that we sometimes have with police interaction in mental health, I do think it's still a majority where things are done right. But I think the questions remain, right? That we have to be asking the questions about when somebody is experiencing mental health crisis, what is the right response? He was in a neighbor's house and he wasn't supposed to be in there. So yes, I can understand why you would want the police to be involved, because on the surface, this is a crime. But, when they arrive at the scene, if they're recognizing this is actually a person in mental health distress, the question becomes, well, what happens now? Is there a way to bring in people who can engage with him in a different kind of way? And just the fact that you have someone coming in who is not a police officer, right? For that person who's in distress, they're more likely to want to trust that person more quickly than the police, because now they're saying, okay, well, this is not a person who might shoot me. This is not a person who might arrest me. This is someone who is trained to try to help people. This is someone who I can feel safe with until whatever is happening subsides. And one of the things that I learned when I was working in crisis and through some of the training I went through is that crisis is a very temporary state. It's something that even if your interventions aren't being effective, it's still going to pass with time because it's exhausting to be at that level. Whatever it is that has caused that crisis, people are expending tremendous energy when they're in that state. It's emotional energy. Sometimes it's physical energy. And at a certain point, you can't keep that up. The person is going to calm down and is going to get to a better state. So sometimes it's just about taking the time to be with that person and just ensure that they're safe long enough that they start coming down to a place where now you can start having a better conversation with.
Wow. Yeah, that is really well said. It brings to mind for me how we're constantly assessing for the safety of our environment. And is this person safe? And we look at their facial expressions and their tone of voice. We might look at their badge or whether or not they have one and how they're coming to us, what presence they're showing up with. And just that alone can actually help to de-escalate a situation or make the crisis manageable.
Yeah, I think there's so much that's going on in these situations. And, you have to imagine yourself as the person who is experiencing the crisis, which, by the way, all of us at different points in our life do and will experience crisis of one kind or another. They don't all look the same. They can be due to many different reasons, but crisis happens to everybody. It's really a part of life. And if I think about times when I've been in some sort of crisis in my life, what is going to make me feel safe? One thing that's going to make me feel safe is if the environment promotes a certain kind of calmness, right? And also a certain sense of predictability. So if I have a person who's coming in and there's flashing lights outside and they have this very official looking uniform on and a badge and they're carrying different things on their belt. Well, that just introduces so much stimuli and it's going to just heighten all of my senses because now there's more things that could be a threat coming, right? I don't know what's going to happen with all the stuff on the officer's belt. I don't know if they're going to view me as a criminal. On the other hand, if I have people who just kind of look like regular people coming into that space and they're talking to me in a calm voice and they're saying reassuring things to me, that's going to help a lot. And then if I'm a person who's experienced a mental health crisis before, and now I see that, well, one of these people's a social worker or a clinician, I may still have some response to that person, not because they don't have really good intentions, but because I might say, well, is this person going to have me transported to a hospital? Is this something where I'm going to end up temporarily losing my freedom due to what's going on? If I've had those kinds of experiences before, it might be even hard to trust the social worker. So that's why the peer element can be really helpful, because if it's now just someone who's like, hey, I've been there, I get what you're going through, I got through it, and you're going to be okay. I'm just another person like you who sort of knows what this experience is like. It just can create such a sense of safety of like, hey, like this is a person who is just another person and their only intention seems to be to help me get through this.
Totally. I want to go back to the point now about referrals back into the system. We don't usually see a physician saying, well, I'm going to refer you to 30 days of your favorite activity with a group of friends.
Mm.
I'm going to refer you to going out with a new person on a walk. We don't usually see that type of pro-social referring out. And so our mindset is oftentimes, okay, the service system can handle this. But what it sounds like is the service system actually isn't equipped to fully handle it. I say all that wondering how peer support kind of is coming in to bring more of that less service system oriented referring to this mix.
The system of services is just incredibly fragmented. It's incredibly difficult for someone to kind of figure out, especially if they haven't been through it before. Even if you work in it, and even if you've been working in it for a long time, like I have, it's still confusing. It still doesn't make sense. You don't know who the person you're supposed to talk to. Everything's in these silos where, mental health is separated from substance use, is separated from other kinds of issues that people might be having. And so that's a real problem, the way that the system is fragmented. And the experience for the person is that they're getting handed from one place to the next, to the next. They have all these appointments. They have all these forms they have to fill out, questions that they keep having to answer over and over again about traumas they've experienced. And that's not always going to be an experience that feels helpful to a person. I really appreciate what you said about the idea of, can we do more to help people be like engaged in those things that they're actually going to like pull some happiness, some motivation, some sort of remembering of what are the things that they have to look forward to. That can be really powerful for people. And that's not to say that people don't get value out of therapy. That's not to say that people might not get value out of taking medication. Sometimes everybody experiences value in the system from different things. And there's a lot of valuable things that people can be offered through the system. But that quality of life issue is sometimes put kind of on the back burner when it actually is maybe the most important thing in that moment. As far as peers go, there's a lot of things that the peers can do here. And one of my absolute favorite things that's out there is what's called peer bridging. This is actually something that the alliance that I'm on the board for, they originated this model back in the 1990s when they were called NIAPRIS. And it's since a model that's been picked up in a bunch of different places, but still probably isn't used nearly enough. And the idea of bridging is that you have a peer who engages with you when you are in that institutional setting. And the idea is that the peer meets that person and forms a relationship with them while they are on that inpatient unit, with the idea that when they get discharged, that peer is going to still be there for that person to help them to get settled back in the community. If they're in a community that they need to learn something about, where's the grocery store, right? Where's the laundromat? How do you manage the bus system there? Like, these are all things that bridger can do so that they have a relationship before the person leaves the hospital, and that relationship continues for a period of time after they leave the hospital. For me, it's a model that's like so adaptable, and we're beginning to see in some places where it's happening. So there's forensic peer bridgers who, the organization I work for, Hands Across Long Island, we have forensic peer bridgers who actually engage with people when they are in state prison. These are people who have mental health challenges, but who are in the prison system. And our bridgers engage them in the prison and then help them to transition and to adapt to the outside community after they've been released. So I would love to see more of that in the homeless system. I would love to see that pretty much anywhere where somebody's in an institutional setting and they are moving to a more independent setting.
peer support seems to be really prolific right now. It's kind of spreading. And as you're seeing this uptick in peer support's popularity, what are some of the hesitations that you have? Because it sounds like you're really pro peer support, but maybe there are some risks at it getting too big too fast, or at the service system being at the helm of its proliferation. What can happen if peer support just becomes another one of those referrals that a doctor or clinician makes?
Yeah. So the thing about systems is usually systems are an attempt at like efficiencies, although a lot of times they're not very efficient. It's kind of like an oxymoron that happens. And so as there's been this like almost explosion of peer roles in settings across the country over the last 10 years, I mean, they're now saying that there may be more than 100,000 certified peers in the United States right now. So the role has expanded tremendously, and with good reasons, because there's been some real evidence that peer support is effective and that people want peer support in their services, that it has some really good outcomes associated with it. But danger is that when you start trying to systemize something that's so much based on building these sort of organic supportive relationships between two people, right? Like how do you do that? How do you do it in a way where peers are really able to value the autonomy of the person in services? There's a real danger that peers can become coercive, where they are trying to steer people towards this service or that service, or to be compliant with their medication regime or things like that. And it's with good intentions, but that's very much against the peer value, right? The peer value, one of them is that it's always voluntary and that it's never coercive. And that has to do with a history of how peers evolved, which is that peers evolved from people having gone through the system and finding that system to be damaging to them and wanting to develop things that were different from the system, right? Alternatives to that system. And so now, as you're actually having peers become part of that system, how do you keep peer specialists true to that part of like, well, but we won't be coercive. And sometimes to work in the system, we actually have to push back against it while we're inside of it. It's a really challenging and delicate balance, because then it means asking yourself tougher questions about like, well, am I actually being helpful in this system? That's a tough thing. And so it remains to be seen of, are we going to get through the current moment of this workforce expansion for peer specialists and see the role really be intact in terms of maintaining its values and principles, or is it going to end up looking very different over time?
Man, it just sounds like it is so tenuous. And on one hand, it's like this desire to like, okay, yeah, good, the system's getting it. Like peer support is important and this needs to be built in, because otherwise then they're just trapped in the same system they've always been trapped in. But on the other hand, becoming part of the system becomes part of the efficiency machine. And to your point about harm being done within the system, then that being the reason peer support exists in the first place. I mean, to hold that at the center of values, but at the same time work in the system would just seem so difficult and challenging. And it is a mind conundrum for me, just thinking about it, not even being in either capacity, like not even being in that role myself. So yeah, it seems like a really big challenge, and one that the future will bear out what course it takes and where peer support is led.
Well, I think despite the challenges that we're seeing with the peer workforce, and despite the fact that it has evolved into something very different than what it was originally conceived as, it really used to be this alternative to the mainstream system and this place for people to really advocate. And that was valuable, but it has evolved to this different thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that it's evolved. I actually think if it's something that used to be only accessible to people if they happened to stumble upon it or were proactive enough to really seek out solutions, it was great for those people. But then what about this vast majority of people who were going through systems and services that just never even knew that option might exist for them, or that someone like them was out there who had recovered and who showed that this is not like an end of life thing, being stuck with this, whatever current challenges you're facing. So by putting it in, the mainstream system, it matters to the people who are actually going through that system, right? That now they actually have this wonderful service that's available to them in a way that it wasn't before. So I think that's a really, really good thing. The challenge is just going to be, how do we keep the fidelity of what it's really about? How do you keep it from being coercive? How do you keep it where people come in and they have a core set of values? How does a peer continue to be what we call a disruptive innovator with the rest of their colleagues in a way that is respected, but that also isn't just everybody subscribing to sort of groupthink about the right way to address challenges? How do we use it as a place to innovate from, as a respected professional who is everyone's colleague, not just someone who's there as cheaper paraprofessional labor?
Yeah, the risk being that peer supporters are just seen as somebody who can either go buy coffee for everyone in the office, or they can go sit down with that person over there and provide help.
Right. I mean, the best case scenario is that by really having a strong and valued voice of lived experience running through the mainstream system, that it actually helps to transform that system into something that is more what people would actually want for themselves, right? Because that should always be the gold standard of any service is, well, what would someone want for themselves? That's what the service system needs to look like. And I don't think there's many people that would say that the way this current system looks is actually the experience they would want to have for themselves. I don't know many people in any role who actually would feel that way about the public mental health system right now.
There's just so many questions I've got at the end of this podcast that it's hard to end, but maybe you could give a final thought, based on everything we talked about, or just what your hope and vision for the future is.
Well, I think I'm always a very firm believer of the idea that you have to have advocacy that's happening in different places and in different levels. I don't think it's realistic to say, well, we just have to burn everything down from the outside. Ultimately, that's just not how societal movements tend to work. And what you really actually have in all of the great change moments is you had people who were advocating from a more sort of mainstream systemic place. And then you had the people on the outside who were really challenging the status quo. And you have to have that pressure coming from both directions. Both are one is just as necessary as the other.
Gosh. I mean, just such an abundance of information here. And every time we talk, Jeremy, I learned so much. So I'm so glad and grateful that you had time to come onto the podcast today and chat. And I hope to have you back on eventually, and we'll talk more. Now I wrote down social movement of peer support, right? That's another episode. So many.
I mean, there's so much we could talk about.
Yes. Yeah. Such a great field. I'm learning about it as I go. And so I hope the listeners are getting a lot out of it too, especially those who are just new to peer support like I am. So thank you. Thanks for being on.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. If you want to go deeper, you'll find links in the show notes. And if this podcast has meant something to you, subscribing or leaving a review helps others find it. See you next time.